The headlines flicker across our screens daily, filled with tension and speculation. Whispers of conflict between the United States and Iran have been a constant undercurrent in global affairs for decades. But beyond the political posturing and the heated rhetoric, a critical question remains. What would actually happen if the simmering tensions were to boil over into direct military action? The consequences would ripple far beyond the immediate theater of conflict, reshaping alliances, economies, and the very fabric of international stability. The stakes are immeasurably high, not just for the two nations involved, but for the entire world. So, what happens next if the US attacks Iran? Let's run the countdown through 5 distinct and increasingly severe scenarios. Number 5. A campaign of limited precision strikes. This is often presented as the surgical option, designed to achieve specific objectives with minimal escalation. The primary targets would likely be Iran's nuclear facilities, such as the enrichment plants at Natanz and Fordow, or key military command and control centers. The goal here isn't regime change or a full-scale invasion, but to deliver a powerful message and degrade specific capabilities, setting back Iran's nuclear program or its ability to project power. The attack would be swift, relying on stealth bombers, carrier-based aircraft, and long-range cruise missiles to overwhelm Iranian air defenses and destroy targets with pinpoint accuracy. The immediate aftermath would see quick but significant damage to Iran's most sensitive infrastructure. The Pentagon would likely declare the mission a success, emphasizing the precision of the strikes and the avoidance of widespread collateral damage. However, the illusion of a clean, contained conflict would be short-lived. Iran's response would be almost immediate, and it would not be symmetrical. Lacking the conventional power to go head-to-head with the US military, Tehran would turn to its strengths. Iran retaliates with drones, swarms of unmanned aerial vehicles, both explosive and for surveillance, would be launched against US military bases in Iraq, Syria, and the Gulf, as well as against the infrastructure of American allies like Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Simultaneously, Iran retaliates with proxy attacks. Its network of allied militias across the Middle East, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to groups in Iraq and Yemen, would be activated. These groups could launch rocket attacks, conduct ambushes on US patrols, and target diplomatic facilities, creating chaos and stretching American military resources thin across the region. In this scenario, the civilian risk rises, not just from potential miscalculations in the initial US strikes, but from the unpredictable and decentralized nature of Iran's retaliation. The conflict would quickly spill into populated areas, blurring the lines between combatants and non-combatants, and creating a volatile, dangerous new status quo. Number 4. A broader air and naval campaign. This scenario unfolds if limited strikes fail to deter Iran, or if Tehran's retaliation is more severe than anticipated, forcing Washington to escalate. The objective shifts from simply sending a message to systematically degrading Iran's entire military capability. This would involve a multi-week, or even multi-month aerial bombardment targeting not just nuclear sites, but also air defense systems, airfields, naval bases, ballistic missile launchers, and the command infrastructure of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The intensity would be far greater than in our previous scenario. US naval forces would enforce a blockade of Iranian ports, strangling its maritime trade and oil exports. The goal would be to cripple Iran's ability to wage conventional war, or to continue its asymmetric attacks. This would not be a short, clean operation. It would be the beginning of a longer war. Iran's military, though outmatched, is resilient and deeply entrenched. It would absorb the initial blows and fight back with everything it has, leading to a grinding conflict with mounting casualties on both sides. The economic consequences would be immediate and severe. Iran would almost certainly attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow choke point through which nearly a third of the world's seaborne oil passes. Even a temporary closure, or the mere threat of it, would cause global oil shocks. Prices would skyrocket, triggering inflation and threatening a worldwide recession. The impact on global commerce would be profound. Insurance rates for shipping in the Persian Gulf would become astronomical, effectively halting much of the traffic. Global supply chains, already fragile, would be hit hard. The flow of everything from electronics to consumer goods would be disrupted, leading to shortages and price hikes for consumers around the globe. The economic pain would be felt far from the battlefield. Number 3. Regional escalation. This is the scenario where the conflict refuses to stay contained, spiraling outwards and drawing in other powerful actors. A US-Iran war would create a power vacuum and a chaotic environment ripe for miscalculation. Neighbors, allies, and rivals would be forced to choose sides, or risk being drawn in against their will. The most dangerous flashpoint would involve Israel. Viewing Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, Israel might see a US attack as a crucial opportunity to conduct its own, more extensive strikes to permanently neutralize the threat. Whether coordinated with Washington or acting unilaterally, Israel gets pulled in. An Israeli strike would guarantee a massive, multi-front retaliation from Iran and its proxies. In response to an attack on Iran or a concurrent strike by Israel, Hezbollah gets pulled in. With an arsenal of over 150,000 rockets and missiles pointed at Israel, Hezbollah would open a devastating second front from Lebanon. This would trigger a full-scale war between Israel and Hezbollah, a conflict far more destructive than their last major confrontation in 2006. The conflict wouldn't stop there. Other regional actors get pulled in. Gulf states like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, who host US bases, would become direct targets for Iranian missiles and drones. They would be forced to fully commit their advanced militaries to the fight. Meanwhile, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria would intensify their attacks, potentially destabilizing those governments and creating a quagmire for US forces. What began as a bilateral confrontation between the US and Iran would now be a catastrophic regional war, turning a strike into a multi-front crisis. The entire Middle East would be engulfed in flames, with unimaginable humanitarian consequences and a geopolitical fallout that would take generations to resolve. Number 2. Asymmetric warfare. This scenario focuses on Iran's strategy of avoiding direct confrontation and instead exploiting the vulnerabilities of a technologically superior adversary. It's a long-term, death-by-a-thousand-cuts approach that could begin after the first strike and continue for years, even if a wider conventional war is avoided. Iran has spent decades perfecting the tools of asymmetric conflict. It understands that it cannot win a conventional fight, so it changes the rules of the game. The battlefield is everywhere, and the conflict has no clear beginning or end. This is a shadow war, fought in the gray zones of international law. A key pillar of this strategy is cyber attacks. Iran possesses sophisticated cyber warfare capabilities. In retaliation for a physical attack, it would unleash state-sponsored hackers to target critical infrastructure in the United States and allied nations. This could mean attacks on the power grid, financial systems, transportation networks, and water supplies. The goal is to cause widespread disruption and panic, demonstrating that Iran can inflict pain far beyond the Middle East, directly on the American homeland, without firing a single missile. Another front would be maritime harassment and shipping disruptions. The Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz would become a constant danger zone. Iran's Navy and IRGC fast boats would engage in a campaign of harassing commercial vessels, laying mines, and potentially hijacking tankers. This creates a climate of fear and uncertainty, driving up insurance costs and disrupting global trade in a way that falls just short of a full blockade, making a decisive military response difficult. Finally, this scenario would be defined by a dramatic increase in covert operations that can last for years. This includes targeted assassinations, funding and arming insurgencies against US allies, and terrorist plots orchestrated by clandestine cells around the world. This long-tail warfare is incredibly difficult to counter, creating a perpetual state of low-grade conflict that drains resources, frays alliances, and keeps the United States entangled in a seemingly endless struggle with an elusive enemy. Number 1. The diplomatic fallout. This is perhaps the most certain and longest-lasting consequence of any US attack on Iran, regardless of the military outcome. The global political landscape would be fundamentally and perhaps irrevocably altered. A unilateral U.S. strike, especially one without broad international consensus or a clear casus belli, would be met with widespread condemnation, even from traditional allies in Europe. They would see it as a reckless act that destabilizes the region and undermines the international, rules-based order they have worked to build since World War II. This would lead to fractured alliances. European partners like Germany and France would distance themselves from Washington, refusing to support the military action and likely imposing their own sanctions on the U.S. This would weaken NATO and create deep, lasting divisions within the Western alliance. Divisions that rivals like Russia and China would be quick to exploit. The United Nations would descend into chaos. Russia and China would use their veto power in the Security Council to block any US-led initiatives, condemning the attack as an act of aggression. The General Assembly would become a forum for anti-American sentiment, isolating the United States on the world stage and eroding its moral and political authority. The ultimate result would be the acceleration of a new geopolitical order that could outlast any conflict. A U.S. perceived as aggressive and unilateral would push non-aligned nations closer to the orbit of China and Russia, who would position themselves as defenders of national sovereignty and stability. This would hasten the transition to a multipolar world, where American influence is diminished and the international system is more fragmented and competitive. This diplomatic blowback could ultimately prove more damaging to long-term U.S. interests than any military or economic consequence of the war itself. The path of conflict is fraught with unintended consequences, where each step can lead to a more dangerous and unpredictable reality. Understanding these potential futures is crucial. For more deep dives into the events that shape our world, subscribe to Timelines and like this video. Let us know in the comments which scenarios you think are most likely, and join us next time for another rapid breakdown of the forces driving our history.